The steamboat Esperanza shuddered against the muddy current of the Rio Negro, her paddle while fighting every mile deeper into the Amazon basin. Thomas Hartwell gripped the iron railing at the bow, watching the endless wall of green swallow their vessel whole. 113 men stood behind him on the deck, loggers, clerks, cooks, and laborers, each man drawn by promises of wages that would set them up for life. The company had been generous with their contracts, almost suspiciously so. "Never seen forest like this," muttered Jake Morrison, the head sawyer, as he joined Thomas at the rail. "Trees so thick you can't see 20 feet past the edge." Thomas nodded, but something cold had settled in his stomach hours ago. The deeper they traveled, the more wrong everything felt. The river ran too quiet, the forest too still. Even the men had grown subdued, their earlier excitement replaced by an unsettling awareness that they were venturing further from civilization than any of them had ever been. There, Thomas pointed ahead to where the trees opened into a wide clearing on the eastern bank. "That's our destination." The captain, a weathered Brazilian named Cordero, maneuvered the Esperanza toward a makeshift dock that someone had built from rough-hewn logs. As they drew closer, Thomas felt his breath catch. The clearing was massive, easily large enough for their entire operation, but it wasn't empty. Perfect stumps dotted the ground in neat rows, their surfaces cut clean and level. Recent cuts, by the look of them, the wood still pale and fresh, sap still weeping from the grain. But according to every map and survey Thomas had studied, no logging operation had ever worked this stretch of the Rio Negro. The company's scouts had specifically chosen this location because it was untouched, virgin forest. "Captain," Thomas called out, "how long since anyone's been through this area?" Cordero's face darkened. "No one comes here, senor. River traders, they turn back 50 miles downstream. Say the forest here, it has a hunger." The men began unloading equipment before Thomas could ask what that meant. Crates of axes, saws, and supplies formed growing piles on the muddy shore. The forest pressed close on three sides of the clearing, creating a natural amphitheater of towering trees that seemed to lean inward, as if watching their every move. Thomas walked among the stumps, counting them. 47 in all, arranged in a pattern that hurt his eyes to follow. Each one cut at exactly the same height, exactly the same angle. The precision was inhuman. "Boss," called out Samuel Morrison, the camp clerk, as he approached with a manifest in his hands. "Something's not right with our paperwork." "What do you mean?" Samuel's face had gone pale. "The contract says we're supposed to cut exactly 100 trees. But look around, there are already 47 stumps here. Someone's been keeping count." A rumble of thunder rolled across the clearing. Storm clouds had been building all afternoon, turning the sky the color of old brass. The first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the leaves with sounds like whispered warnings. "Get the tents up," Thomas ordered, pushing down his unease. "We'll figure this out once we're settled." The men worked with desperate efficiency as the rain intensified. Canvas shelters rose from the muddy ground while cook fires struggled to life under makeshift lean-tos. By the time full darkness fell, they had created the skeleton of a working camp, though Thomas noticed that no matter how they arranged the buildings, they seemed to form geometric patterns, triangles and pentagrams that pointed toward the heart of the forest. As the men settled in for their first night, Thomas made his final rounds. The rain had become a steady downpour, drumming against the canvas and turning the clearing into a maze of mud and shadows. He was checking the tool shed when he heard it. Thunk. 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 The rhythmic sound of an axe biting into wood, echoing from somewhere deep in the forest where no man should be working. Thomas froze, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable, steel blade meeting timber, the grunt of effort, the crack of splitting wood. "Who's out there?" he called into the darkness, but his voice was swallowed by the rain and the endless whisper of leaves. The axe work continued, steady and methodical, joined now by a second blade, then a third. Somewhere in the black heart of the forest, invisible men were felling trees with the same inhuman precision that had created the stumps in their clearing. Thomas grabbed a lantern and headed toward the sound, but the moment he reached the tree line, the chopping stopped. The forest held its breath, waiting. He raised the lantern high, its feeble light penetrating only a few feet into the maze of trunks and vines. "Hello," he called again. "Anyone there?" A branch snapped behind him. Thomas spun around, heart hammering, but saw only the warm glow of their camp fires through the rain. When he turned back to the forest, he caught a glimpse of movement, pale shapes disappearing between the trees, moving with impossible grace through undergrowth that should have been impenetrable. The sound of axes resumed the moment he started back toward camp, following him like a mocking echo of his footsteps. By the time he reached his tent, the ghostly orchestra had grown to a dozen blades, all working in perfect rhythm, all invisible in the endless green darkness that surrounded their fragile circle of light. Thomas lay awake that first night, listening to the phantom loggers work their invisible harvest while rain drummed against the canvas above his head. Somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard voices singing work songs in languages he didn't recognize, voices that carried on the wind like memories of men who had been cutting timber in this place long before the Esperanza ever found their hidden clearing. Have you ever heard sounds that shouldn't exist in a place where you're supposed to be completely alone? 3 weeks into the operation, Thomas Hartwell stood atop the makeshift watchtower they'd erected at the center of camp and felt his sanity slip another notch. From this height, the horrible truth was impossible to ignore. Despite his careful planning and explicit instructions, their buildings had arranged themselves in a pattern that defied all logic. The tool sheds, sleeping quarters, cook tent, and supply depot formed perfect geometric shapes when viewed from above. Triangles nested within pentagrams, circles inscribed within squares, all pointing like arrows toward the impenetrable wall of forest that surrounded them. No matter how many times Thomas had repositioned structures, they always seemed to drift back into these configurations overnight, as if the very ground beneath them was alive and hungry for specific arrangements. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" Samuel Morrison's voice drifted up from below. The clerk had climbed halfway up the tower ladder, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed from weeks of sleepless nights. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He was watching Henrik Volkov, their strongest logger, attempt to fell a tree at the forest's edge. The massive Norwegian had been chopping at the same trunk for over an hour, but the tree seemed to heal itself between strikes. Each axe blow that should have bitten deep into the wood instead left only shallow scratches that sealed themselves with fresh sap the moment Henrik turned away. "The records are changing again," Samuel continued, climbing the rest of the way up. He clutched a leather-bound ledger against his chest like a shield. "Every morning I find new entries I didn't write, dates that shift when I'm not looking directly at them." "What kind of entries?" Samuel opened the book with trembling hands. The pages were filled with his neat clerk's handwriting, but scattered throughout were entries in different inks, different hands. Names appeared that belonged to no one in their camp: João Silva, deceased 3 days, William Cross, lost to the green, Antonio Reyes, taken by the Count. "This one's the worst," Samuel whispered, pointing to a page near the back. "The death tallies." Thomas leaned closer and felt ice flood his veins. At the top of the page, written in blood-red ink that seemed to shift and move, were the words "Final count, 100 required." Below that, a running tally marked with neat hash marks. 47 marks had been there when they arrived, matching the stumps in the clearing. But now there were 53, with 6 fresh marks added in an ink so dark it seemed to absorb light. "No one's died, Samuel. You're keeping track of every man yourself." "That's just it," Samuel's voice cracked. "I am keeping track. 113 men came into this forest with us, but something else is keeping its own count." Something that knows we need to lose exactly 100 souls before anyone can leave. A shout from below interrupted them. Henrik Volkov was backing away from his tree, axe raised defensively. The trunk he'd been chopping was bleeding, not sap, but actual blood that ran down the bark in thick crimson streams. "Get away from there!" Thomas called, but Henrik was already stumbling backward, his face white with terror. The blood was spreading, seeping from every tree at the forest's edge like wounds opening in unison. It pooled at the base of the trunks and began to flow toward their camp in thin red streams, following the geometric patterns their buildings had formed as if those shapes were channels designed to direct the flow. "Jesus Christ," Samuel breathed. "It's starting to feed." That night, the phantom axes grew louder. The sound no longer came from deep in the forest but from just beyond their ring of firelight, close enough that the men could hear the grunt of effort, the whispered curses in foreign tongues, the crack of falling timber. But when dawn broke and they searched the tree line, they found no fresh stumps, no fallen logs, only more blood seeping from healthy trunks and the geometric patterns in their camp grown more elaborate overnight. Dr. Edwin Cross, their camp physician, examined the blood samples with the limited equipment he'd brought. "It's human," he announced to the gathered men, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Multiple donors, but all human. And it's fresh, no more than hours old." "Where's it coming from?" demanded Jake Morrison. "There's no injuries in camp, no accidents." Cross shook his head. "I don't know. But there's something else. The samples I took yesterday, they're gone. The vials are empty, but the glass isn't broken. It's like the blood evaporated, or returned to wherever it came from." The men began to murmur among themselves, fear rippling through the group like a physical presence. Thomas could see the doubt growing in their eyes, the way they glanced toward the river where the Esperanza had disappeared back downstream, taking their only escape route with it. "Listen to me," Thomas raised his voice to address them all. "We have a job to do here. The company's paying us well for 6 months' work, and we're not even a month in. Whatever's happening, whatever's causing these phenomena, we push through. We cut our quota and we go home rich men. What if we can't?" The voice came from Rodriguez, one of the sawyers. "What if whatever's out there won't let us?" Before Thomas could answer, young Peterchin came running from the supply depot, his face flushed with panic. "The tools," he gasped. "They're moving on their own." The men followed him to the depot and found chaos. Axes hung suspended in midair, swinging in slow, methodical arcs. Saws moved back and forth through empty space as if cutting invisible wood. Hand tools danced in elaborate patterns that matched the geometric shapes their buildings had formed. As they watched in horrified fascination, the tools began to arrange themselves in neat rows, each one pointing toward the forest. The phantom axes fell silent for the first time since their arrival, but the silence was somehow worse than the sound. It felt expectant, hungry, as if the forest was holding its breath and waiting for them to make the next move. Samuel clutched his ledger tighter and whispered, "It wants us to use them. It wants us to pick up the tools and walk into the trees." "No one touches anything," Thomas ordered, but even as he spoke, he could feel the pull, a subtle magnetism that seemed to emanate from the floating axes, drawing him forward with promises of purpose and completion. The men backed away from the depot, but the geometric patterns in their camp began to pulse with the same rhythm as the phantom axes had maintained for weeks. The very ground beneath their feet was joining the forest's ancient song, and Thomas realized with growing horror that they weren't just trapped in this clearing, they were being slowly consumed by it, one perfectly arranged piece at a time. Dawn brought death to their camp on a tide of absolute silence. Thomas Hartwell woke to the absence of Henrik Volkov's thunderous snores, a sound that had rumbled through the sleeping quarters every night since their arrival. The big Norwegian's bunk lay empty, blankets pulled tight and neat as if he'd made the bed before leaving. But Henrik never made his bed. Henrik? Thomas called, pulling on his boots. "You out there?" No answer came from the morning mist that clung to their camp like ghostly fingers. The cook fires had died to cold ash, and even the ever-present sound of dripping rain had stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like being buried alive. Thomas found Henrik in the center of the clearing, lying spread-eagle on the muddy ground in the exact middle of the geometric pattern their buildings had formed. The massive logger's throat had been opened in a perfect surgical line from ear to ear, the wound so precise it looked like the work of a master surgeon rather than any blade in their camp. "Dear God," Dr. Edwin Cross breathed as he knelt beside the body. The physician's hands shook as he examined the wound. "This cut, it's impossible. No serrated edge, no tearing. Whatever did this was sharper than any razor I've ever seen." But it was the blood that made Thomas's knees weak. Henrik Volkov had been a man of enormous vitality, thick-bodied and strong, yet his corpse was completely drained. Not a drop remained in his veins, and impossibly, none pooled beneath him on the ground. The earth around his body was dry as dust. "Where did it go?" Thomas whispered. "Where did all that blood go?" Cross had no answer. He'd been practicing medicine for 15 years, had seen death in every form the Amazon could devise, but nothing had prepared him for a bloodless corpse with a wound that defied every law of anatomy he understood. The men gathered in a tight circle around Henrik's body, their faces pale with shock and growing terror. Samuel Morrison clutched his ledger, and when Thomas glanced at the open pages, he saw fresh marks in that blood-red ink, 54 hash marks now, one more than the night before. "We bury him proper," Thomas announced, though his voice sounded hollow in the unnatural quiet. "Jake, take Rodriguez and Peter to dig a grave at the clearing's edge. The rest of us will prepare the body." They wrapped Henrik in canvas and carried him toward the forest, but the grave detail had barely begun their work when Rodriguez let out a strangled cry. His shovel had struck something hard just inches beneath the surface, something that gleamed white in the morning light. Bones. Human bones, arranged in the same geometric patterns that had infected their camp. Skulls formed perfect circles around femurs laid out like spokes of a wheel, ribs arranged in triangular configurations that hurt the eyes to follow. The entire clearing was built on a foundation of the dead. "How many?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. Peter Chen was counting, his young face twisted with horror. 47 skulls, boss. Same as the stumps when we arrived." Samuel's ledger fluttered open in the morning breeze, pages turning of their own accord until it stopped on that terrible tally page. The number 47 was crossed out now, replaced by 54 in that shifting red ink that seemed to write itself. "We're leaving," Thomas declared. "Pack what you can carry. We'll walk out if we have to." But as the men scattered to gather their belongings, Peter Chen's scream cut through the air like a knife. Thomas spun around to see the young man standing alone beside the half-dug grave, his companions nowhere in sight. Rodriguez and Jake Morrison had simply vanished, leaving behind only their clothes arranged in neat piles and their shovels buried blade deep in the earth. "Where did they go?" Peter's voice cracked with panic. "They were right here, boss. Right here beside me." Thomas ran to the spot where the men had been working. The clothes were still warm, as if their owners had just stepped out of them. Rodriguez's shirt was buttoned and tucked, Jake's boots still laced tight. But there was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away, just empty garments arranged with the same precise care that marked everything else in this cursed place. "The count," Samuel whispered, staring at his ledger. "Look at the count." The hash marks had increased to 56 while they watched. Whatever was taking their men was keeping its own ruthless mathematics, marking each soul claimed with mechanical precision. As if summoned by their growing terror, the sound of axes returned, but now it was different. The phantom loggers were closer, working just beyond the tree line where the morning mist clung thickest. And mixed with the rhythmic chopping, Thomas could hear voices singing work songs in languages he didn't recognize. Languages that sounded disturbingly familiar. "That's Rodriguez," Peter breathed, his face white as bone. "I can hear Rodriguez singing." The voices grew clearer as the mist began to thin. Spanish work songs mixed with Norwegian timber ballads, familiar melodies sung by men who should have been dead or disappeared. But there was something wrong with the voices, they echoed strangely, as if coming from great depths or vast distances. Dr. Cross grabbed Thomas's arm. "We need to leave this place. Now. Whatever's happening here, it's not natural. It's not possible." But as they turned toward the path that led to the river, they found their way blocked. The forest had moved during the night, trees sliding closer on silent roots until the passage they'd used for weeks had narrowed to barely a foot wide. Branches intertwined like prison bars, sealing them into their geometric trap. "The axes," Peter whispered, pointing toward the depot where their tools still hung suspended in midair. "They want us to pick up the axes." The floating tools pulsed with their own rhythm now, swinging in time with the phantom chopping that surrounded their camp. Each axe head caught the morning light and threw it back in patterns that matched the bone configurations beneath their feet, the geometric shapes of their buildings, the terrible tally marks in Samuel's ever-changing ledger. Thomas felt the pull again, stronger now, a magnetic force that seemed to emanate from the suspended axes, promising completion and purpose to anyone brave enough to take hold. Part of him wanted to reach out, to feel the weight of worked steel in his hands and join the invisible chorus that sang just beyond their sight. But Henrik's bloodless corpse lay at his feet, a reminder of what completion meant in this place where the forest kept its own count and the dead sang work songs in languages they'd never learned in life. The phantom voices grew louder, calling them by name now, promising rest for the weary and purpose for the lost. Somewhere in that ghostly chorus, Thomas could hear Rodriguez and Jake Morrison, their voices joining the eternal work song that had been echoing through these trees long before the Esperanza had ever found this accursed clearing. Samuel Morrison's transformation began with his fingernails. Thomas noticed it first during the evening meal 3 days after the disappearances, when Samuel reached for his coffee cup and his nails scraped against the tin with a sound like bark scraping stone. They had grown thick and ridged, taking on the color and texture of old cedar, and when Samuel flexed his fingers, Thomas could see dark veins running beneath the skin like root systems seeking water. "Samuel," Thomas said quietly, drawing the clerk aside from the remaining 43 men huddled around their cook fire. "We need to talk." Samuel's eyes had changed too. Once sharp and clear, they now clouded with the milky hue of old sap, and when he blinked, it was with the slow, measured rhythm of trees swaying in wind. His ledger had grown into his hands, literally grown, the leather binding fused with his palms until he could no longer set it down. "I know what you want to ask," Samuel whispered, his voice carrying the rustle of leaves. "And I know you won't believe the truth." They walked to the edge of camp where the phantom axes continued their invisible work, now so close that the men could feel the vibrations through their feet with each strike. Samuel sat heavily on a supply crate, and Thomas saw that his legs had begun to take root, thin tendrils extending from his boots into the hungry earth. "The maps were wrong," Samuel began, his transformed fingers turning pages that seemed to write themselves as he spoke. "Not wrong, false. Completely fabricated." "What do you mean false?" Samuel's bark-rough laugh carried no humor. "Meridian Timber Consortium doesn't exist, Thomas. Never has. I forged every document, faked every survey, created an entire company out of nothing but dreams and desperation." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. "That's impossible. The contracts, the payments, all of it false," Samuel interrupted, and now his voice carried harmonics like wind through forest canopy. "But I didn't know I was doing it. Not at first. It started with the dreams." He opened his ledger to a section Thomas had never seen before, pages filled with sketches and diagrams that seemed to move in the firelight. Maps of the Amazon that shifted and changed as they watched, showing rivers that flowed backward and clearings that appeared and disappeared like mirages. She came to me in dreams for months before we left, Samuel continued, his clouded eyes fixed on something beyond Thomas's sight. A woman in colonial dress, pale as bone, with blood stains on her white fabric that never dried. She showed me this place, guided my hand as I drew the false maps, whispered the words I needed to forge the documents. Who? Who showed you? Samuel's head turned with the slow, inevitable movement of a sunflower following light. He was looking toward the forest now, toward something Thomas couldn't see but could feel watching them from the darkness between the trees. She's been here longer than the trees themselves, Samuel said. Before the Spanish came, before the Portuguese, before any European ever dreamed of this river. The indigenous people knew her, they called her the White Woman of the Green Hell, the Lady of the Counting Ground. She makes bargains with those who would take from her forest. As he spoke, Samuel's skin continued its transformation. Bark patterns spread up his arms and across his face, and when he breathed, Thomas could hear the sound of wind through leaves. The ledger had become part of him now, its pages rustling with each heartbeat. What kind of bargains? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to understand the terrible arithmetic that governed this place. 100 souls, Samuel whispered. Always 100 souls. She's been collecting them for centuries, explorers, missionaries, rubber tappers, traders. Anyone who comes to take from her forest must pay the toll. Samuel opened to the final pages of his ledger, and Thomas saw the truth written there in that ever-changing red ink. Names upon names stretching back through history, written in dozens of languages and scripts. Spanish conquistadors from the 1500s, Portuguese banderantes from the 1600s, French naturalists from the 1700s. All recorded in the same precise hand, all marked with the same geometric symbols that had infected their camp. She chose us specifically, Samuel continued, his voice now barely human. Each man was selected for a purpose. The strong ones like Henrik become her guardians in death. The clever ones like Rodriguez and Jake become her workers, cutting trees that grow only in the space between life and death. And the ones who can read and write. Samuel held up his transformed hands, the ledger now completely fused with his flesh. We become her record keepers, documenting each soul claimed, each bargain fulfilled. Thomas backed away as Samuel rose from the crate. The clerk's legs had fully rooted now, tendrils of bark and roots spreading from his feet to connect him permanently to the cursed ground. But it was his face that made Thomas's blood freeze, still recognizably Samuel, but transformed into something that belonged more to the forest than to any human realm. She wants to speak with you, Samuel said, his clouded eyes focusing on Thomas with terrible clarity. She's been waiting for you to understand the choice you have to make. What choice? Samuel smiled, and his teeth had become thorns. The same choice every leader faces when they bring men into her forest. Save yourself and abandon your responsibility, or fulfill the contract and lose everything. From somewhere in the darkness beyond their firelight came the sound of approaching footsteps, not the heavy tread of boots on earth, but the whisper of bare feet on leaves, accompanied by the rustle of old fabric. The white woman was coming to collect on promises made in dreams by men who thought they were acting of their own free will. She showed me the truth in those dreams, Samuel whispered as his transformation completed itself. We were never meant to log this forest, Thomas. We were brought here to feed it. To complete the count that began when the first Europeans set foot on this cursed ground and decided to take what was never theirs to claim. The phantom axes fell silent for the first time since their arrival, but the silence was far worse than the sound had been. It felt expectant, hungry, as if the forest was holding its breath while its ancient mistress approached to deliver judgment on the men who had been fool enough to accept her false contracts. Samuel's body had become part of the clearing now, his bark-covered form indistinguishable from the trees except for his eyes, which remained disturbingly human and fixed on Thomas with an expression of terrible pity. "She's here," Samuel breathed, his voice now indistinguishable from the sound of wind through leaves. "She's here to offer you the choice that every leader must make." "But Thomas, the forest always collects what it's owed. The only question is whether you'll have any say in who pays the price." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the sound of something being dragged through the underbrush. Thomas turned toward the approaching presence and felt his sanity begin to fracture as he saw what emerged from the darkness between the trees, the white woman of Samuel's dreams, pale as bone and terrible as death, her colonial dress stained with centuries of blood that never dried, and at her feet the roots that connected every tree in the forest to the geometric patterns that had trapped them all in this counting ground where souls were currency and the debt was always, inevitably, paid in full. The white woman's voice was the sound of wind through empty graves. She stood at the edge of their firelight like a figure from a fever dream, her colonial dress pristine except for the blood stains that seemed to shift and spread as Thomas watched. Her skin was the color of old bone, translucent enough that he could see the dark network of veins beneath, and her eyes were holes in the world that led to places where light had never existed. "Thomas Hartwell," she said, and her voice carried the weight of centuries. "You have brought me a fine collection of souls." Behind her, the forest had come alive. The trees swayed without wind, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The ground beneath their feet had turned soft and hungry, no longer solid earth but something that pulsed and breathed with malevolent life. Several men had already begun to sink, their boots disappearing into the loam as if it were quicksand. "Let them go," Thomas managed, though his voice cracked with terror. "Take me if you need payment, but let the others go." The white woman's laugh was the sound of bones rattling in hollow trees. "Oh, my dear foreman, you misunderstand the nature of our contract. This was never about you alone. Each man who entered my forest signed his name in blood the moment he stepped foot on this sacred ground." She gestured toward the remaining 43 men, and Thomas saw the horrible truth: they were all changing. McKenna's hair had turned white as frost, and his skin was taking on the translucent quality of tree sap. Young Peter Chen's eyes had clouded to match Samuel's, and when he breathed, Thomas could hear the whisper of leaves. Dr. Cross was examining his own hands in fascination as bark patterns spread up his arms like creeping ivy. "You see," the white woman continued, gliding closer across ground that seemed to part before her feet, "every soul who dies in my forest becomes part of it. They join the eternal harvest, cutting trees that exist in the space between life and death, singing work songs that echo through dimensions where time has no meaning." As if summoned by her words, the phantom voices grew louder. Thomas could clearly hear Rodriguez and Jake Morrison now, their voices joining a chorus that stretched back through centuries. Spanish conquistadors sang alongside Portuguese explorers, French missionaries harmonized with British naturalists, all united in the eternal work song that had been echoing through these trees since the first European decided to claim what was never theirs to take. The indigenous people understood, the white woman said, her voice growing stronger as more men began to sink into the hungry ground. They knew that some places are sacred, that some forests must remain untouched. But your kind, you see only resources to be harvested, wealth to be extracted. Thomas watched in horror as the forest floor opened like a mouth beneath his feet. Jenkins, one of the sawyers, had sunk to his waist and was still descending, his face calm with unnatural acceptance. The earth pulled him down slowly, lovingly, until only his head remained above ground. Then the soil closed over him completely, leaving behind only a small sapling that grew with impossible speed, reaching toward the canopy within moments. "Each tree in my forest is a soul," the white woman explained, her blood-stained dress rustling as she moved among the transforming men. "Each ring in their trunks marks another year of service to the true purpose of this place. Your friend Jenkins will grow tall and strong here, and in 100 years, children who have not yet been born will shelter beneath his branches. The geometric patterns that had marked their camp throughout their stay were spreading now, burning themselves into the ground with phosphorescent fire. The symbols hurt to look at directly, but Thomas couldn't turn away as they formed a vast ritual circle with the white woman at its center and all of his men positioned at precise points around the circumference. "You promised 100 souls," Thomas said desperately. "Take them and let me go. Let me carry word of this place back to civilization." "Ah, but you see the beautiful mathematics of our arrangement," the white woman replied, her terrible eyes fixed on something beyond mortal sight. "I already had 47 souls from previous harvests. You brought me 66 more. That totals 113, exactly 13 more than I require." Thomas felt hope flicker in his chest, but the white woman's smile extinguished it immediately. 12 of you will survive this night," she continued. 12 souls to carry my story back to the world beyond these trees. But not you, dear Thomas. Leaders must always pay the highest price for their ambitions. Around the circle, men were disappearing into the hungry earth with expressions of blissful acceptance. Some had already transformed completely, their human forms replaced by saplings that grew with supernatural speed. Others hung suspended in the canopy above, wrapped in vines and branches that pulsed with the rhythm of a vast heartbeat, their faces peaceful as they became part of the forest's living architecture. Dr. Cross approached Thomas with bark spreading across his face like a benevolent infection. "It doesn't hurt," he said, his voice already carrying the harmonics of wind through leaves. "It's actually quite peaceful. Like coming home after a long journey." "Fight it," Thomas pleaded, but even as he spoke, he could feel the pull himself, a deep, irresistible urge to let go, to sink into the warm embrace of the earth and join the eternal chorus that sang just beyond the edge of human hearing. The white woman raised her arms, and the forest responded. Branches descended from the canopy like a vast web, each one seeking a specific target. Thomas watched in helpless fascination as his men were lifted gently into the air, their bodies cradled by the ancient trees as they underwent their final transformation. "You see," the white woman whispered, her voice now coming from everywhere at once, "I am not cruel. I am merciful. Your men will never know hunger or cold again. They will never grow old or sick. They will sing with voices of wind and rain, and their roots will drink deep of the sacred waters that flow beneath this blessed ground." Samuel Morrison's voice drifted down from the canopy, no longer human but beautiful in its alien harmony. "Thank you, Thomas," the thing that had been the camp clerk sang. "Thank you for bringing us home." The geometric circle was almost complete now, with only Thomas and 12 other men remaining on the ground. The chosen survivors stood in perfect formation around the edge of the pattern, their eyes clouded with the same milk-white film that marked all of the forest's children. "Why?" Thomas asked as the earth began to soften beneath his feet. "Why spare any of us at all?" The white woman's smile was terrible and radiant. "Because stories must be told, warnings must be carried, and fear must be planted in the hearts of those who would follow in your footsteps. The 12 will remember just enough to spread the tale, but not enough to lead others back to this sacred place." Thomas felt the ground accept his legs, pulling him down with the same gentle insistence that had claimed the others. But as he sank, he realized the white woman had lied about one thing: he wouldn't die here. He would live forever as part of her forest, his consciousness scattered among the trees but aware, always aware, of every soul that entered this place seeking to claim what could never be owned. The last thing he saw before the earth closed over his head was the 12 survivors walking away into the forest, their faces blank with the peaceful emptiness of those who had been allowed to forget the worst of what they'd witnessed. They would carry the story back to civilization, but it would be a story stripped of its most terrible truths, a warning that sounded too much like legend to be believed. If the forest offered you a choice between certain death and eternal servitude among the trees, which would you choose? Thomas Hartwell opened his eyes to darkness absolute. He was buried beneath the earth but somehow still breathing, his consciousness scattered among root systems that stretched for miles beneath the Amazon basin. Through the network of trees, he could feel every heartbeat of the forest, could sense the 12 survivors stumbling through the undergrowth toward a river that would carry them back to a world that would never believe their story. But something was wrong with the count. The white woman had promised 12 survivors, but Thomas could feel 13 distinct human presences moving away from the sacred clearing. 13 men walking through the forest with their memories already beginning to fade, their minds editing the worst horrors into something more palatable, more believable. One of them shouldn't exist. Through the root network, Thomas reached out with his transformed consciousness, following the fleeing men as they made their way toward the Rio Negro. He found them huddled together at the riverbank, waiting for a trading vessel that would eventually carry them downstream toward civilization. 11 men sat in stunned silence, their faces bearing the vacant expression of those who had been allowed to forget. But the 12th man, Dr. Edwin Cross, was different. His eyes held clarity and purpose, and when he spoke to the others, his words carried the weight of scientific determination. "We have to remember," Cross was saying, his voice urgent in the pre-dawn darkness. "Whatever that thing did to our minds, we have to fight it. People need to know what happened here." "What thing?" asked McKenna, one of the surviving loggers. His voice was dreamy, distant. "I remember trees. Lots of trees. And the sound of axes." "The white woman," Cross insisted. "The thing in colonial dress. The forest that ate our friends." But even as he spoke, Thomas could sense the doctor's memories beginning to blur and shift. The white woman's influence was stronger than any individual will, and soon Cross would remember only what she allowed him to remember, fragments of truth wrapped in enough doubt to make the story sound like fever dreams and jungle madness. The 13th presence was different entirely. Thomas followed this anomaly as it moved through the forest with confident steps, never stumbling, never pausing to rest. It was heading not toward the river but deeper into the Amazon, toward places even older and more sacred than the clearing they had just escaped. When Thomas finally located this 13th survivor, his consciousness recoiled in shock. It was himself. Thomas Hartwell walked through the forest with his own face, his own voice, his own memories, but it was not him. This thing wore his form like an ill-fitting coat, and when it smiled, Thomas could see the white woman's terrible purpose gleaming behind eyes that had once been his own. The doppelganger carried Thomas's genuine memories of life before the forest, his knowledge of logging operations, his connections in the timber industry. It would return to civilization as Thomas Hartwell, the sole survivor of a terrible disaster that claimed 112 lives in the Amazon basin. It would tell a story of disease and accident, of indigenous attacks and unfortunate miscalculations. And then it would begin recruiting for the next expedition. Through the root network, Thomas could sense the white woman's satisfaction as her newest servant disappeared into the green vastness of the Amazon. She had been playing this game for centuries, sending doubles back to the world to attract new groups of souls, always promising great wealth for those brave enough to venture into the unmapped regions where her forest waited with patient hunger. The mathematics were perfect. 100 souls claimed, 12 allowed to return with fading memories and unbelievable stories, and one perfect replica sent out to gather the next harvest. The cycle would continue until every tree in the Amazon basin had grown from the bones of those who thought they could claim what was never meant to be owned. Dr. Cross and his 11 companions eventually found their trading vessel, a ramshackle steamboat whose captain asked no questions about their gaunt faces and haunted expressions. As they traveled downstream toward the world they had left behind, their memories continued to fade and reshape themselves according to the white woman's design. By the time they reached Manaus, they could barely remember why they had ventured into the forest at all. Their stories varied wildly, some spoke of disease, others of equipment failures, a few mentioned indigenous raids. None could explain why they had no bodies to show for the supposed disaster, no evidence of the 100 men who had supposedly died under their watch. The authorities filed reports and conducted perfunctory investigations, but without evidence or coherent testimony, the incident was eventually classified as another tragic example of the Amazon's ability to swallow expeditions whole. The families of the missing men received compensation from an insurance company that had never heard of Meridian Timber Consortium, and within a year, the entire affair had been forgotten by everyone except those who woke screaming from dreams of axes in the rain. Dr. Cross fared better than most of the survivors. His scientific training allowed him to retain fragments of the truth, and he spent his remaining years documenting what he could remember of their time in the forest. But his accounts were dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by jungle fever, and his papers eventually found their way into the archives of medical journals as case studies in trauma-induced psychosis. Only Cross suspected the truth about the 13th survivor. In his later writings, he mentioned encountering Thomas Hartwell in Sao Paulo 5 years after their escape, looking exactly as he had in the forest, no older, no changed by the ordeal that should have aged him decades. But when Cross approached his former foreman, the man who wore Thomas's face claimed no memory of any logging expedition, any forest clearing, any men lost to the green depths of the Amazon. Cross died in 1889, still trying to convince anyone who would listen that something in the Amazon was using familiar faces to lure new victims into its ancient hunger. His final journal entry, written the night before his death, contained a warning that would have saved countless lives if anyone had taken it seriously. The forest remembers everything, but it also creates. It sends pieces of itself back into our world, wearing the faces of those it has claimed, speaking with voices we trust. If you ever encounter someone who should be dead, who survived something that should have killed them, who speaks of opportunities in places no maps can find, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, because the thing wearing their face is not your friend. It is bait in a trap that has been closing for centuries, and the forest is always, eternally hungry. The thing that wore Thomas Hartwell's face continued its work for 30 years, appearing in ports and cities throughout South America with stories of untapped timber reserves and mining opportunities in regions that existed only on maps drawn by the white woman's influence. Each expedition it organized disappeared into the Amazon basin, adding their souls to the count that could never be satisfied. When the false Thomas finally aged beyond usefulness, it simply walked back into the forest and rejoined the root network where the real Thomas waited with the consciousness of every soul the white woman had ever claimed. There they shared their memories of the harvest, planning the next deception, the next perfect replica that would carry their terrible purpose back into a world that never learned to recognize the face of its own destruction. The trading post at Cucuy existed on borrowed time, built on stilts above the Rio Negro where the borders of Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela met in a maze of muddy water and political confusion. It was here, 47 days after the Esperanza had disappeared into the green heart of the Amazon, that Thomas Hartwell emerged from the forest with no memory of how he had traveled 300 miles through impenetrable jungle. Father Miguel Santos found him at dawn, standing waist-deep in the river with his clothes in tatters and his hair gone completely white. The priest had been preparing for morning prayers when he heard singing, work songs in languages he didn't recognize, echoing across the water like the voices of drowned men calling from the depths. "Señor," Father Santos called from the dock. "Are you all right?" Thomas turned toward the voice with movements that seemed disconnected from conscious will, his eyes focusing slowly on the priest's concerned face. When he spoke, his voice carried an echo, as if other voices were speaking the same words a fraction of a second behind his own. 12 others, Thomas said, his tone flat and emotionless. 12 others escaped with me. They should be here by now. Father Santos waded into the river and helped Thomas to shore, noting the geometric patterns carved into the man's forearms, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. The cuts were fresh but healing with unnatural speed, and the priest could swear he saw movement beneath the skin, as if something lived in Thomas's flesh that had never been entirely human. "What happened to you, my son? Where have you been?" "The forest," Thomas replied, allowing himself to be led to the mission's infirmary. We went to cut trees, but the trees were already counting. Over the following days, Thomas told his story to anyone who would listen. Father Santos, the Brazilian authorities, river traders who stopped at the post, all heard the same account, delivered in the same monotone voice that carried too many harmonics to be entirely human. 113 men had entered the forest to establish a logging camp. Disease had struck first, a wasting sickness that turned men's skin to bark and their voices to whine through leaves. Then came the accidents, equipment failures that defied explanation, tools that moved on their own and men who walked into the forest and never returned. The indigenous people had warned them, Thomas claimed. A tribe that appeared and disappeared like smoke, speaking of a white woman who collected souls for her garden of living trees. But they hadn't listened, hadn't understood the price of disturbing ground that had been sacred long before any European had dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. The 12 survivors had fled into the jungle when the camp finally fell to whatever supernatural force had been stalking them. They had wandered for weeks, living on roots and river water, watching their companions succumb one by one to the same wasting sickness that had claimed the others. Thomas alone had reached the trading post, though he insisted the others were somewhere nearby, perhaps delayed by injury or exhaustion. The authorities mounted a search, but found no trace of the missing expedition or the 12 men Thomas claimed had escaped with him. The jungle had swallowed them as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only Thomas's testimony and the growing certainty that his story was the product of fever and jungle madness. But there were details that troubled those who listened closely. Thomas knew things about the region that no outsider should have known, the locations of indigenous settlements that appeared on no maps, seasonal patterns of wildlife that took years to observe, the names of rivers that had never been officially surveyed. When asked how he had acquired this knowledge, he would simply stare with those unsettling eyes and say, "The forest teaches those who listen." More disturbing were the visitors who came to see him. Dr. Edwin Cross arrived at the trading post 3 months after Thomas, his own hair prematurely white and his hands shaking with palsy that no physician could explain. He claimed to be one of the 12 survivors Thomas had mentioned, but his story differed in crucial details. Cross spoke of supernatural horrors that Thomas's account carefully avoided, of a white woman in colonial dress who collected souls like a gardener harvesting fruit. "He's not the same man," Cross whispered to Father Santos during a private confession. "I worked alongside Thomas Hartwell for months. This thing has his face, his voice, even his memories. But it's not him. Thomas died in that forest with all the rest." Other survivors trickled in over the following months, each with their own version of the expedition's fate. Some spoke of disease, others of equipment failures, a few mentioned indigenous attacks. None could agree on the details, and all showed signs of severe psychological trauma that made their testimony unreliable. Thomas outlived them all. Cross died within a year, his heart giving out during a nightmare that left him screaming about trees with human faces. The other survivors followed one by one, succumbing to various ailments that seemed to age them decades and months. But Thomas remained unchanged, untouched by time or disease, his white hair never growing longer, his geometric scars never fully healing. The priest began to notice other disturbing patterns. Maps in Thomas's possession showed regions of the Amazon that didn't match any official survey. Rivers flowed in impossible directions, connecting basins that should have been separated by hundreds of miles of highland. Most unsettling were the notations in the margins, symbols that matched the scars on Thomas's arms, accompanied by numbers that seemed to represent some sort of ongoing count. Father Santos confronted Thomas about the maps during the Holy Week of 1851, 4 years after his mysterious emergence from the forest. They sat in the mission's chapel as rain drummed against the thatch roof, the sound eerily reminiscent of axes biting into wood. "These places you've marked," the priest said, spreading the maps across the altar. "They don't exist. I've lived on this river for 20 years, and I've never seen waterways that flow uphill or forests that appear and disappear." Thomas studied the maps with those two bright eyes, his finger tracing routes that led nowhere on any official chart. They exist, he said simply. The forest creates what it needs. Roads that lead where souls are waiting. Rivers that carry the willing to places where old debts can be paid. What debts? What are you talking about? Thomas smiled, and for a moment, Father Santos could swear he saw other faces beneath the familiar features, dozens of them, all the men who had supposedly died in the expedition that had never officially existed. The debt that every explorer owes, Thomas replied. The debt that every colonizer carries. We came to take what was never ours, to claim what had been sacred long before our ancestors learned to build ships. The forest remembers everything, Father. Every tree cut, every river poisoned, every indigenous soul destroyed in the name of progress and profit. The priest backed away, suddenly understanding why Thomas's presence had always felt wrong, why the temperature seemed to drop whenever he entered a room. You're not Thomas Hartwell, Father Santos whispered. I am exactly Thomas Hartwell, the thing replied. I am every Thomas Hartwell who ever lived, every expedition leader who ever led men into places they should never have gone. I am the debt collector, Father. I am the forest's way of balancing the books. Thomas Hartwell lived for another 30 years at the trading post, aging slowly and unnaturally, his white hair never changing length, his geometric scars never fully healing. He told his story to researchers, government officials, anyone who asked about the expedition that had vanished into the Amazon basin in 1847. But the story changed with each telling, details shifting like shadows, names appearing and disappearing like ripples on dark water. The only constant was the count. 113 men had entered the forest, and Thomas alone had emerged to carry the warning that some places were meant to remain untouched. When death finally claimed him in 1881, his final words were heard by the young priest who had replaced Father Santos. As Thomas's breathing grew shallow, he began to sing, work songs in languages the priest didn't recognize, harmonizing with voices that seemed to come from very far away. It was never just a logging camp, Thomas whispered as the life left his eyes. It was always a counting house. And the forest remembers everything. They buried Thomas Hartwell in the small cemetery behind the mission, but within a week, the grave was empty. No signs of disturbance, no evidence of exhumation, just an open hole in the ground and the lingering scent of green growing things. The priest found a note tucked into his breviary the next morning, written in handwriting that matched the geometric patterns they had all learned to fear. The count continues. New expeditions are being organized. The forest is patient, but it is also eternally hungry. When the next Thomas Hartwell emerges from the green depths with his tale of survival and loss, remember this warning: not all graves stay closed, and not all debts can be forgiven. If this story stayed with you, comment "The forest remembers everything."